My name is Isabelle McConville, and I am a bookseller and producer here at Barnes& Noble. And I am so excited to be here with the author of Alchemized, SenLinYu. Sen, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. This is such an honor.
I'm so happy to hear that. I've been really excited about this conversation. I've been looking forward to it for a while. I have an early copy of Alchemized here, and if or any of our listeners on YouTube can see this, it's about as big as my head, and that's a great thing.
Yeah, it was a little shocking to actually see the arcs come into the world and see how big they were. Because I knew it was long, um, and I had a lot of long books in my house. And so I was like, okay, this isn't like, it's a little much, but it's okay. And then I saw the actual advanced reader copies and I was like, oh no, they're really big.
I think that's such a good thing, though. I think we need bigger, chunkier books, and especially ones that are like that. Like this is such an epic. So I'm very excited for readers to get it in their hands, and I'm excited to get my final copy as well.
So soon now.
No, so we are recording this a few weeks ahead of the on sale date. So I wonder if you can just tell me a little bit about what your days are looking like right now and how you're feeling.
So it's in the run up, it's been relatively quiet, but just sort of kind of mentally preparing, getting everything at home settled because I will be traveling for longer stretches than I have in the past. And so I have kids, so trying to make sure that they're prepared, that they understand, and they also know just how to go about the day-to-day routines without me. So it's a lot of the focus is on that. And then I'm still currently working on my next book, and so I have been sort of in the research phase. I like to cast a really wide net when I first am coming up with what I want to write about, and so I will have like a very broad sense of the topics that I want to explore, and then I just go and I read like every book that seems tangentially related to that subject I find interesting sounding. So I'm kind of currently in that the deep dive phase, and so I've been reading a lot, and some of those are audiobooks. So then when I'm doing audiobooks, I will just keep myself busy with like crafts and organization and those types of things. So it's just kind of a lot of prep, and then been doing some interviews. So kind of all staying kind of in the same kind of split between two headspaces of like moving into this new project and kind of ruminating on that, but then also trying to stay fresh because I do still have to talk about Alchemized.
Yeah, I can only imagine it's such like a bizarre feeling to get ready to kind of release this book into the world after holding it so close. I mean, what is it like to kind of to see this book in my hand and to know that readers are going to be poring over, each sentence? And I excuse that pun.
Yeah, it's weird because having come from like online writing where it's very much more of an instant gratification. You write, you post within normally a few days to a few weeks of writing that thing, and then you immediately get comments and emails and those types of things. So the transition to working on something kind of in private for a very long time, only having a few eyes on it, that was very scary, especially at first. I was just so used to being able to kind of use people as a touchstone of like kind of consulting with getting reactions from all over. And all of a sudden, I was kind of like on my own having to do this and just sort of trust my gut. And even when I was writing online, I was pretty stubborn about if I knew where I wanted a story to go, even if I was getting comments and people who disagreed or didn't like it, things like that. I was like, well, maybe this one isn't for you. But it was still it was still weird to just be on my own and just have to trust my instincts as a writer, and then just the traditional publishing formatting of like you're working on the manuscript, then you send the entire thing away to your editor and you wait for some weeks before you hear back from them. And so it's just like that long silence
Mm.
was a little bit terrifying to go through, especially the first time. Um, but at the same time, at working on something, because I always have in the past written serially, and so getting to work on a whole entire project, like a very large project, and getting to go over it, and change things versus kind of being kind of cemented in with your past choices and you can't really go back was a different experience, and it did feel richer in a lot of ways that I could actually fine tune things in a way that I hadn't been able to in the past.
Wow, yeah, that makes sense. I also wonder if you can tell me a little bit about that kind of like untraditional, I guess you could say, publication process of, starting out online and then bringing this into a physical book for people to get their hands on. Can you remember the moment you knew you really wanted to write this story and how it became alchemized?
Yeah, I mean, it's been such a strange evolution,
Mhm.
and the story is really close to my heart. It was something very much born like a passion project. It involves on so many levels. It has things that I really care about or feel really strongly about. So thematically, a lot of the different things that it like moral questions that it wrestles with, the types of character choices are things that like for me, they are sort of unimaginable. And so I kind of process these sort of questions that scare, terrify me, or these decisions that I find paralyzing by like writing about them and having like creating characters that wrestle with these questions for me. And so it was it's like a very personal passion project for me. Um, and so when I was having some issues with the online iteration of it, I was sort of it was quite I was quite torn because I knew that it was also really, really important to other readers. And I didn't want to do this sort of collective punishment of there are people causing problems with this, and so therefore nobody gets to have it. But at the same time, I just couldn't keep up with like the scale of the issues that I was encountering. Like it was pretty much a full-time job just trying to manage that, and it was just not sustainable. Like I didn't have time to even write anymore because I was just dealing with all of this stuff. That was all I was doing as my hobby was kind of dealing with the like the fallout of this. Um, and so when I had the idea to change it and to rework it into Alchemized, that was sort of liberating. It was kind of like because I could just kind of reclaim it more and all of a sudden have people that were in my corner more supporting me in being able to enforce my ownership of the story versus it being like all on me asking people to like please don't do this to me. um which can most people were, but then when you have just like a few really proactive bad actors, you feel like you're screaming into a void. And so it was sort of I knew it was giving me a very skewed sense of the people that cared about the story because the only ones that I was really dealing with were the people that were kind of acting in bad faith or bad actors and those types of things. And so it was just but at the same time I was like, I know that there's people because I've gotten these beautiful letters from people who have read this, and it's been so deeply important to them in different times and periods in their life. And I don't want to disregard that in the way that I move forward. And so it was sort of it was quite an emotional process, and quite fraught trying to find the right balance in how to proceed.
Yeah, but through all of that, hardship that you went through with this book to get it to where it is now, I have to truly say, like, the final product is worth it. It is such a great, great book. This was my at home book since it's so big. I didn't want to lug this around and take it on the train with me every day. So I truly was looking forward to getting home each night and just sitting down and sinking my teeth into this book. It was just such an immersive reading experience, and I really also I think that the atmosphere and the world that you built, the characters, just made it so immersive. I wonder if we can talk a little bit about character actually. Helena was so compelling and alive. I truly loved her character. I found myself so invested in her story and so worried sick about her pretty much every time I opened the book. Can you talk to me a little bit about like finding her voice and just creating her background and bringing her to life in this book?
Yeah, so one of the things with Alchemized was that it was very philosophically rooted. Alchemy is very, very rooted in philosophy, Greek philosophy
Mm,
specifically, where what happened was that Aristotle wrote the Meteorologica, and that got translated and imported over to Egypt. And the Egyptian metallurgists, they utilized his philosophy to inform the way that they practice metallurgy. And then that got re-imported back to Europe like hundreds of years later, and that became Western alchemy. And so it's this very weird Greek philosophy, Egyptian metallurgy into Western alchemy journey, but it was very, very rooted in Aristotle's philosophy.
mm,
And so when I was developing the story and I was developing the world building, I wanted to have a very I wanted to give it a very, very philosophical basis for how the societies evolved. One of the books that was really impactful for me when I was in my early 20s was actually this book called The Geography of Thought. And it talks about how Western thinking is very, very formed by Western philosophy, a lot of Greek philosophy, the way that we categorize things, the way that we see time and things like that. Whereas Eastern thinking is very, very informed by Confucianism, which tends to think of things as more circular and cyclical and things like that. And so you have these very distinct modes of thinking, and that causes those societies to evolve very, very differently. You have the way that they treat and interact with nature and the world and other people, very, very different because of that. And they will do these tests where they will give somebody like a photo or something, and they'll ask them to analyze it, and they can like there's a degree of consistency in how somebody who is raised in a Western area, like philosophically, or an Eastern area philosophically, which things they will notice and how they will interpret the picture, and that are very tied to those philosophies. And so with Helena, I wanted to create a character who was an outsider and had this sort of outsider's view of the world that she was in, but she did want to be there. It was where she considered herself belonging, but because she had this outsider perspective that was sort of like had a slightly different like philosophical basis because she came from an island country, and so they were a lot more isolated and they sort of got to evolve on their own rather than being as influenced by the Northern continent's ideas and philosophies. And so, because of that, she doesn't have the same, like, sort of base level assumptions and assurance that about things that everybody else around her does, because everyone else has grown up in this more homogenous society where there's just all of these fundamental truths about the world that everybody has, that everyone is raised with, and they just don't question those things because that is just what they have always heard for generations. And so she's coming in and she's wanting to believe all these things as well, but she just doesn't have that like gut instinct inclination to do so. And so that kind of puts her just like slightly out of step with everybody, and it gives her a different perspective. But at the same time, this isn't she isn't in a situation where she can argue or point out the fact that she sees things differently, because she does want to belong, and she is kind of in this position of kind of being this charitable perpetual outsider situation in some regards. And so the ways that she tends to like act and try to reconcile those things was really interesting in developing her as a character. um but it was also really helpful to kind of give her this kind of outsider lens on this more very homogenous, because Palladia is a city-state, so it's very geographically small, but it's very, very intensely, it's very intensely developed and very, very dense. And so you have kind of like all of these same ideas percolating and evolving in this very small space, and then you have this outsider who's just come from a totally different perspective, who's trying to meld in with these things, but at the same time, they just don't have all those fundamental assumptions that everyone around them does.
Yeah, that makes sense because I was thinking a lot about how she interacted with everyone around her at the institute. And I liked how you made her essentially like an immigrant to this city state, and she had this outsider's perspective, like
Mhm.
you were saying, at the institute. And I think that that also impacted the way that she saw their religious beliefs as well.
Mhm.
And a big theme in this book is religious abuse and what it means to really lose yourself in a cause or in a belief. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that and like how she functions within that theme.
Yeah, I mean that was really for me that was the kind of the starting point
Mm,
seed of where she was going to struggle the most with this society that she was in was the fact that they had all of these just deep sense of trust in this particular narrative that they
mhm.
do these particular things and this will be the outcome because that is just what is the result of having this particular faith. Um, and it was because I actually saw, it was actually, funnily enough, it was inspired by a tweet, and it was somebody pointing out um, that if people in like India or something celebrated Groundhog Day the way that the US does, like the way that it gets covered in all of the news, that if this little groundhog sees its shadow, then we're predicting what the next couple weeks of the year are going to be like. If another country did that, we would be like, wow, that's so backwards that they would do that. But then, and so it was that tweet was actually that tweet was actually sort of like the initial seed, but then also just different like religious rituals and how I was raised very religiously, and so there are certain religious practices that I'm just like, oh yeah, that's just how it works. But then I'll encounter somebody who wasn't raised in that, and they're like, there are like several weird leaps of logic like going on with this. But then if I come across some other religions practices, I'm like, oh, that's so weird. Why do they believe that? That's so clearly just like a weird, like psychologically manipulative practice that is just trying to give people this feeling. And so I can see it in other religions, but at the same time, because I was raised from like the cradle in this religion where you have these assumptions, it's a lot harder. I have to kind of like very intentionally make myself pause and step back and try to like put myself in the shoes of somebody who wasn't raised in this in order to try to like wrap my mind around how that would come across or how hard it would be to get on board with that concept just if I was just coming in as like somebody who was in my teens or an adult or something. Like try like what the mental like jumps would have to be to try to believe that thing, which I don't have to just I didn't have to struggle with because that was just what everybody told me. So I just assumed that that was how it worked.
That's what I think the greatest part about reading and writing great fiction is that it causes us to question our beliefs even if we hadn't before. And I wonder if it's something about putting ourselves just in the shoes of someone that we can call fictional, someone that's not ourselves, and kind of having that degree of separation.
Yeah, and honestly, that's what I particularly love about fantasy and science fiction. There's a kind of sort of cultural like pretentiousness, snobbery towards genre fiction because it's not dealing with the real world, it's not dealing with real life. But I think that at least for me, I find that because fantasy sort of steps out of whatever your pre-established like positions or views are, and it gives you a new situation that may have parallels, but it's not the exact one that you know where you know which side you're on.
Mhm.
um, it sort of allows you to kind of suspend your disbelief and kind of step into the situation in a way that is a lot harder to do if you already have like a kind of a firm position that you don't really want to change when you read something literarily. And so if you have a reader who has a particular bias about a certain type of person, and then they're reading real life fiction or genre fiction or something like that, and they're like, oh, it's about this type of person. I'm obviously not interested in their perspective or something like that. Whereas with genre fiction, because it's a bit more plot focused, but also because it's a different world, there's a little bit more of a suspension of disbelief that you can kind of go along with. And then you kind of, in the process of, I don't know, the empathy that you feel, you can sort
Mhm.
of come at that thing in a way that is a lot harder than if you were just trying to write that in the real world, like write a real world depiction of that thing. Um, I've always found that to be really helpful for me creatively, just because like I will often have sort of these moral quandaries that I'm dealing with, and sometimes they're very, if you've read Alchemized, you know they can be very, very dark moral quandaries. And it's not really something that I would want to wrestle with in real world fiction, because that is so much more charged with so many different things historically, that I would have to try to take into account while I was writing. I wouldn't just be able to focus on these like particular things or questions that I was wanting to deal with. I would also have to take into account like actual real world history and all of these different contextual things. And that is just, and then by the time you get bogged down in all the things that you need to take into account to even ask this question in the first place, you've sort of, it's a little bit hard to hold on to the plot at that point. And
Mm,
so with fantasy, you're able to just kind of slice through that, like right to the core of the heart of what you're wanting to ask. Um, and obviously you still want to like deal with these external ramifications. I don't, my one issue I do have with fantasy is that it kind of often will simplify those things. And it is
yeah.
this very black and white, good versus evil. And oftentimes good is very, very traditional and wants to go back to the past or restore the king or something like that. And I have some issues with that kind of thing. And evil is what's progressive, wants to change, wants to do something new. And so I don't I am suspicious of that tendency in fantasy, but at the same time, I do think it is a space that allows you to explore things in a way that's a little bit more full without having to account for everything, every real world historical event that as you would in real world fiction.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why I really like this book is because it's so accessible. I think that you can go in thinking you believe one thing and you know what you're going to experience from this book and come out the other side of it totally changed. At least that's what happened for me. And it causes, and I think reading great fantasy books like this and like what you're talking about really fosters empathy. And this is what great fiction does. You know, this is why we need books. So this is why we need empathetic people in the world, right? So that brings me actually to Kane. I want to talk about Kane for a second. Um, he was a tragic, broken, and tortured character who
Mhm.
I found myself so invested in, so worried about. Because he was also open to love at one point, and then he's also open to hope, although I don't think he'd ever admit that.
Mhm.
Can you tell me a little bit about creating his character and really like finding that voice and creating his background?
Yeah. So I again, it kind of comes back to because he and Helena are such contrasting characters
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of ways. Where she is, because she's an outsider, she doesn't have the same degree of disillusionment and like loss of belief in like the world or existence,
Yeah.
because she was always a little bit like had a foot out of the Kool-Aid that everybody else was like immersed in. Um, and so for her, when she is slowly like disillusioned with a lot of the narrative and lies and realizes that a lot of it is invented, she still like retains a measure of hope and a determination that like living, surviving, is is meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas for a character like Cain, he was raised in Palladia. And so as he grows increasingly disillusioned with both sides, that just kind of puts him into this sort of like nihilistic black hole where nothing
Mm-hmm.
matters, there's no meaning, they are in the abyss. That there's just nothing, it does nothing that they do matters. And so when he finds something that matters to him, like everything else is irrelevant. Like the fact that he has decided one thing matters, that does not mean that anything else around him matters. And so, kind in a lot of ways, that's kind of the collision point between him and Helena. In a lot of ways, is the fact that she is similarly very, very intelligent, and she's similarly disillusioned, but she is willing to make meaning rather than say, oh well, if the universe doesn't care, then
Mm-hmm.
I don't care either. She's like, no. I will still choose to care, even if none of this has a point, even if all this suffering does not have some large scale, universal, deity-based like meaning. I can still create meaning through the actions that I take and the choices that I make. And his reaction is just to kind of despair and just say nothing matters because there is no larger purpose. Um,
Hmm.
and that because he was raised in this environment where these very much like fundamental assumptions, truths were what he was disillusioned from, he wasn't in a position where he had anything to land on
Right.
when that happened to him. Whereas for Helena, because she was an outsider, because she had this like kind of external grounding in just having seen more of the world, knowing that like not ev like that Palladia and Palladia's ideas are not the whole world, she had more of an ability to sort of like retain her sense of self and
Mm.
like sense of purpose despite the disillusionment that she went experienced.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Their dynamic was so complex and so just honestly addicting to read. I loved both of them as characters. And the way that they bounce off of each other was so so great. But they also endure so much in this book. So this book is really about the horrors and brutalities of war. At least that's one of the things that it's about. The brutalities of war that the people fighting them experience, those keeping the threads of the world together in the background experience. And there's also those people who sit back and watch just what people will do to each other. And we see a little bit of all of that in this book. Can you tell me about what it's like to write about those difficult kinds of subjects and how you protect yourself as the author when you're immersing yourself so deeply in that world?
Yeah, so I had a weird teen phase of being very interested in Victorians and their horrible, horrible medical practices. Um, it was a very, it was a black hole that I tripped and fell into and left me deeply disturbed for a long time. Um, and then it sort of from there kind of resulted in me learning about a lot of the kind of the activities that occurred then in World War II, like the experimentation and things like that. And it was sort of weird to realize that most people were very unaware of some of those types of things.
Mhm.
And because when you, I don't know, watch movies, like all the big movies, or you read a lot of the popular fantasy books and stuff, war is sort of this spectacle. It's this backdrop for epic, for either visual epic or emotional epic. And it doesn't necessarily always deal with the fallout
Mhm.
of what the reality of war really is. And so, I mean, and I love a good action scene. Honestly, when I was writing Alchemized, I struggled because I would write these very long action scenes because I would get really into like the all of the mechanics of how it would work for them to characters to fight in these ways. And then I would be like, I am 8 pages deep and making this really cool, and this is not really the point, and I have to like cut away. Um, but I wanted the story to be very much focused instead of being the war being this epic spectacle
Mhm.
for this like amazing love story or something like that. I wanted the war to be this horrible character, like
Mm,
one of the characters in this story and the worst one. And
yeah.
they just touch everybody and they're like poison where everybody they touch, it's just they're slowly eroding as a result of being touched by it. And
Mhm.
so when I was writing, I had this one photograph of this World War II fighter, and he joined. I think it was two photos of him, and it was when he joined, and he was like 16 or 17 years old. He was very young, and then it shows him after the war, and it's only been like 4 or 5 years, and he is so incredibly aged. Like he looks 30 years older, and there's just like this starkness to his face and his eyes. There's just this like you can just see all of the like atrocities and horrors that he has lived through, and it's just all written in his face in just a few years. And so I had that photo and I pulled it up and I would reference it on a regular basis as I was writing, especially And I was thinking about the character of Luke, that he would
Mm,
that was who I that was the picture that I would look at when I was writing Luke scenes. Um, but I wanted the war to be not about like the epicness of a fight scene or
right.
the high stakes fun like the fun like heart clenching like high stakes element. I wanted it to be much more about like this is what war is actually like. And you don't get to reach the end and just move on from it. Like, this is something that if you survive, the trauma, the ways in which you coped are something that will haunt you and it will ripple into the future with your children and things like that. And that was partly inspired by the fact that my grandparents on my maternal side, I'm half Japanese, and they were interned in the U.S. concentration camps during World War II,
Mm,
after Pearl Harbor was attacked. And so my grandmother, she was 16 years old when she was placed in an internment camp, and then my grandfather, he actually went and he fought, and it was for the a lot of these young Japanese American men, they were trying to prove that they were these good Americans, and so they joined the military, and they went and they fought in this war in Europe, even though their whole family was living in a camp in the desert behind barbed
right.
wire in what were basically sheds. Um, and so the and he lost his leg in that war. And so in the way that I wrote it, I wanted to show like the horrificness and then also just the way that it's not just this thing that happens and it's over. It's like it's a wound and then it's a scar. And that scar does
Mm,
not just go away. Um and then also because I wanted to write like particular dynamics between Kane and Helena, um I wanted to make sure that their choices made sense because of the context that they were in. Like I didn't want to write about like codependency or these really intense like decisions, these really extreme decisions just because that made for a great story. I wanted there's these choices to make sense because of the stakes that they were constantly having to live through, the loss that they were constantly witnessing, the atrocities and the risks that they knew they were always dancing like on the edge of like this is the drop that you could potentially experience. And so obviously you were going to make much more extreme decisions than you if you were in a safe environment with stability and the ability to access psychiatric help or something like
yeah.
that. Those options are not there for you. You are just having to survive and try to find a way to drag the people that you cannot bear to lose along with you in that process.
Yeah, and I that makes me think of one of my favorite lines from this book. I wrote it down here in my notes, just hoping I would get the chance to ask you about it. I'm gonna read it. A healer and a killer circling slowly, the push and pull inexorable. Can you please tell me about writing that line and just what that says about Helena and Kane's dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, when I was coming up with Helena's character, I I wanted her to be a lot more than just like, oh, this tender-hearted healer who just wants to help people and she can't kill somebody, so that's why she's a healer, is because she doesn't want to be violent or she's too delicate and sweet to be violent. And instead in Helena's case, it's this choice that she makes, that she knows that she can do more by being a healer than she could if she goes into combat, because she wasn't raised learning to fight the way all these people around her were, where they were from the cradle learning how to perform these type of combat. She's coming into it as a late teenager, and so she's trying to learn that she just knows she's never going to be particularly good at this. And so she's like, what is the real contribution that I can make, not because I'm above killing or adverse to it, but just because I want to do the most helpful thing that I can do. And so that's why she's a healer. But the thing is that that choice is like so intensely traumatic for her because it removes her from the like I don't know the aura of heroism, the halo of heroism
Yeah.
that everybody else gets to bask in, that they are heroic, that they are brave because they are going out and fighting. And instead, she is in this situation of standing in the aftermath of all these battles and trying to save these people that have been horrifically maimed by these fights, and watching them die, or if they do survive, if she helps them, if she's able to save them, then like it's the praise goes to the gods, like the gods must have guided your hands and those types of things. um and so she's not acknowledged, like the choice is something that she's not acknowledged, the choice her effort is not acknowledged, and she's also sort of treated as sort of like cowardly and unheroic because she's not fighting. um and it was inspired because I read a book in my teens. It was set in World War II era, where a brother gets drafted into the military, and gets sent off to Europe, and he's writing to his sister, and he's telling her about how he can't imagine killing somebody, that it's just not in him. He's just too sensitive. He can't imagine murdering another human being. And so eventually he said after the course of several letters, he finally is like, I have decided that I'm going to be a medic, because that way at least I can do something. And even I was like 16 or something when I read this, and I was just like, how is not killing somebody and instead trying to save somebody's life, just at least I can do something. Like that was
Yeah.
such a slap in the face, the idea of that. That like killing people is heroic in the battlefield is heroic, but trying to save people in the battlefield and not being there to defend yourself or anything like that, but you're just there to try to keep other people from dying, like that's a coward's choice,
Mm.
was just an absolutely bonkers like premise, but it was very based in that period of how the books at that time were trying to present fighting and joining the military, because there was kind of
Yeah.
that very propagandized era about World War II, and just military heroism in general. But it was just such a absolutely crazy rationale to just kind of come across in this book, and it stayed with me. And so when I was coming up with the killer and healer, this dynamic, it was really interesting to have somebody who was incredibly ruthless and who had killed people in really awful, awful ways. And that was what made them so valuable, so incredibly useful. And yet she had saved an incalculable number of people. She's like the inverse of that. And in a way that was completely unacknowledged, and in a way that was at great cost to herself. And that was kind of seen as the lesser path. Um, and it kind of made me think of like the yin yang symbol,
Yeah.
and the kind of that push and pull, and the way in which a lot of, I mean, in a lot of societies, there's this gendered treatment of certain things and it was actually really interesting studying alchemy, because there's a lot of ideas about like feminine versus the masculine, and women are wet and cold, and men are hot and virile and and all those kinds of things. And then similarly with yin and yang, that there's this that yang is like more active and everything, and then yin is much more passive. And so but anyway, so I was thinking about that as I was writing that line. And yet like the thing is that the balance of both is so vital. And so trying to say like, oh, only one of these things is important, or this one is fundamentally better because it is more useful, in then just ignoring everything else that the other contributes, because it's just not as convenient to acknowledge those things. Um, that was very much kind of what inspired that particular line.
I am so glad that I asked you about that because that was so interesting. I also you talked a little bit about some of the books that have helped you get to where you are right now. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about your influences and just the books that made you want to become a writer, because I think that I could see so many different types of influences. I mean, this story is also such a great gothic story. I was thinking about just like the hallmarks of a gothic story. Like I was thinking about Rebecca, or also I was thinking about just how you wrote this war, and you really got into the details of like the politics, and that made me think of like the Poppy War trilogy, for example, or like Babel. And so I wonder if you can just tell me a little bit about the books that really made you want to be an author, and even just what you're reading now.
Yeah, so gosh, I mean, there's so many across the years. Honestly, the two books that I feel like really like kicked me in this direction the hardest were The Book Thief, which I read in
Mm.
my late teens. And that one was just so deeply moving. That was the moment when I was like, absolutely, I am going to write a book someday. Like, I want to write a book.
Wow.
Feels like I felt reading this book. But I didn't then. It was like basic, but it planted the seed that just kind of like lived inside of me for a very, very long time. And then years later, I think I was probably 27 or so, 27, 26, 27. I read The Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell, and that is a very interesting science fiction book that is about these Jesuit priests that go travel through outer space to go and evangelize to an alien planet that has been discovered to have intelligent life on it. And the crew that they travel with is are all non are not religious. And so there are all of these really interesting conversations about faith and belief and those types of things that the characters go through. And one of the characters in that is a doctor. And when they get to this alien planet, one of the other characters dies, and she, as the doctor on the crew, she has to perform an autopsy on this person that she has now known for years, and she has to try to
Oh
figure out
my
like
God.
what killed him. And she comes out and she's incredibly traumatized by it, and everyone is trying to get her to tell them like what caused this person to die. And she's like, there's no reason, there's no clear reason that why he died. I could not find any reason. And she's describing like she had to examine his heart, she had to cut out his brain, she had to examine his brain, and this is somebody she knew, and she's cutting him into pieces and examining him in components, and she's so traumatized from this. But everyone else just wants answers, and so they just keep asking her questions until eventually she snaps and she screams at them that he died because God wanted him to die. And everyone is shocked into silence. And then she's like, why
Wow.
is it that whenever somebody survives, God did it, but when somebody dies, it's my fault. Like if you want to know why this person died, God let him die. And it was such a confronting scene, and it very much inspired me in writing Alchemized, kind of the way that I wrote Helena as a healer.
Hmm.
Um, but again, it was just reading these characters wrestling with these questions in this really interesting way where you understood all of the different perspectives, like even if you didn't agree or believe the same things. Like this story did such a good job of kind of exploring all the different motives and beliefs that each of these characters had as they're all interacting with each other in these very high stakes environment. And so that was kind of really the next book that was like really like I really want to write something that also lets me wrestle with the questions and ideas that I have. And so those were kind of really the two that kind of pushed me into the path of finally starting to write. As far as like big influences, for Alchemy specifically, it was kind of a mixture of literature, that books that I'd read over the years, and then also I read a lot of nonfiction.
Mm.
Whenever I have like even a passing interest in something, I tend to pick up a book on that subject. And then a lot of the times it kind of spider webs and like they mention something, I'm like, oh, that sounds interesting. And then I just kind of like keep chasing the
It
down.
sounds it sounds like you're a rabbit hole reader, like
I am
a
very
lot of us here.
very much. So for Alchemized, there was like on the one hand, there was a very big influence of some different nonfiction books, like Svetlana Alexievich's
Mm.
Unwomanly Face of War, where she had gone and she interviewed all of these Ukrainian women who fought in during World War II and got their kind of version of what it was like to fight in the war because there was such a specific narrative about these women who fought and what kinds of people they were and how brave they were that was very much just this narrative of the victory type of depiction. And so she was going and she was talking to these women individually, and it was really interesting because they would constantly be like, oh, you shouldn't talk to me, you should talk to my husband because I don't talk about the war the right way. He always gets angry when I
Mm,
talk about the war because I don't explain it the right way. And because and then when Alexievich was moving forward with publishing the book, the censorship office actually get involved and was very opposed to her publishing the book, wanted to cut all these different parts out because they said that showing these women doing these different things was kind of destroying the illusion of what these women were supposed to have been during the war. And it was very much, again, just kind of like, no, we have to create this narrative about what the war was, what the victory was. And it's all about these ideas of fighting for these things. And all of these women, and then a lot of the men are very bought into that of like, oh, yes, we were fighting for the motherland and so therefore all of the suffering, all of the death, all of those things were worth it. But for these women, they couldn't buy into this ideology, even though they were in these same battles, in these same places that these men were. And so I was very influenced by those interviews. And then also a podcast. I had listened to like an 8 hour long podcast specifically about the Eastern Front, and the experience of Russia and Germany's fighting instead of the more common narratives about England and France, the French resistance, and some of those types of things that tend to be focused a lot more, especially in like US like media and everything.
mhm,
So that podcast also just kind of because that war was such a horrific grind and it was so vital, and yet somehow it's just not talked about. It's not acknowledged almost at all, but it was just the like that was listening to that podcast all those years ago was really when I kind of like realized for myself just like how atrocious and awful the stakes and the context of war was in a way that I hadn't appreciated in a lot of the books that I had read up until that point. Um,
mhm.
and then on the Gothic end, funnily enough, the book that I thought about the most while I was working on Alchemized was Frankenstein, actually. Which
Oh,
was funny. It was not what I thought. I thought I would think more of Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights, just
yeah.
because with Jane Eyre, you have that house that obviously has some kind of interesting mystery that you're sort of unraveling as the story progresses. And then Wuthering Heights, you have that just like very intense character, two characters very intensely drawn to each other. So I kind of assumed that that was kind of where my mind would go when I was writing. But I actually very frequently found myself thinking about Frankenstein, and Mary Shelley, and a lot of the idea of like creating a life or creating a monster and and what that means. But in Frankenstein, it's a man who creates this monster and then is so horrified at what he's done that he just rejects it. And so I was when I was writing Alchemized, I kept thinking about like if a woman created a monster, I don't think she would abandon it. I think she would stay. Um, and and so
Wow.
that was sort of the like a thing that I kept thinking about with Helena was that like if she created a monster, she would not leave it. She would stay with it. And so and part of that was thinking about the context in which Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein because her mother had been one of the great feminist philosophers, and then she died shortly after Mary Shelley's birth. And then Mary Shelley herself, when she wrote the book, she had just recently had her own child die. And so she was not only like the product of a death as a result of creating a new life kind of situation, but she also was in that state of grief after having lost her own child. Um, and so thinking about like that context of writing a story like Frankenstein dealing with this sort of rejection being overwhelmed by the reality of having created life, and yet it's very much in this like kind of masculine male hubris sort of context was just was something that I don't know, I kept finding myself thinking about it a lot. And so yeah.
And it gave us another one of my favorite lines from the book. If he's a monster, then I'm his creator. So good. So good. That makes perfect sense. I love that Frankenstein is one of the influences for this book because it's not something I would have thought of going in, you know what I mean? Or even I didn't realize that even reading the book, and I should have, but that's such a great influence. And I think there's a movie coming out
There
soon
is.
too.
I'm so excited because I've always been so annoyed at all of the typical like on-screen depictions of Frankenstein. I did watch years ago. I watched the show Penny Dreadful, and there
Oh.
that has an interesting Frankenstein character in it. But yeah, I've been historically very annoyed about depictions of Frankenstein, but I'm very hopeful about Guillermo del Toro because he is such a, I don't know, he's such an inspiration to me. The Crimson Peak was definitely a book that I thought about a lot, or a movie that I thought about
Mhm.
a lot, like atmospherically, that house and the story
Yeah.
and everything, and the way, and just the way that he utilizes the idea of monsters in his work. Of a lot of the times we tend to I've read a couple of articles about his work, and people pointing out basically that a lot of times monsters are treated in media and in literature and movies and everything as like this sort of like the worst version or this most extreme version of this failure or human flaw that we don't want to that we want to deal with and show how grotesque and awful it is, and how he instead writes these monsters, but in this way where he really loves them and he loves the way that it shows like the fragility, and it shows this sort of awareness of a character like with an awareness of their monstrousness, and that that requires a certain degree of like caution and everything, and in trying to reconcile your existence with the world that wants to reject you. um
Yeah.
and so, and I just really love that because I really enjoy the idea of monsters. I've always been very drawn to that. And yet it's never been in that sort of like lurid, oh yes, I love like the vampire slaying and those types of things, but more it's like the concept of like, why do we come back to this way? What is it about this idea that draws us? Like, what would that be like to be in that situation? And those types of questions has been always what I've been more curious about. I feel like he
Mhm.
explored those a lot more versus the kind of the um treating it as like an extreme version of a vice.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. We are brushing up against time, so I do want to ask you one last thing. Is there anything you want readers to know about this book or its characters that we haven't talked about? Or is there anything you want to say to your readers who've been here with you since the online days?
Oh my goodness. Way to put the pressure on. I don't know. It's so hard. I tend to be very reluctant to dictate or tell people like, oh, make sure you notice this thing or
Yeah,
come away with this particular thing. Um, Partly just because I feel like it's sort of like fighting against a tide where you can't really tell people how to interpret something.
right.
Um, and also because I don't like sometimes like the online discourse that can result from saying like, oh no, I wrote it to be interpreted this way. And then people
Hmm.
are like, oh, Sen said that it's supposed to be interpreted this way. You're interpreting it wrong. And so we're gonna like fight in the comments or something about that. I like to just kind of step back a little bit more and just let people experience it. And sometimes for ill. Um, but uh, I guess yeah. I mean, I guess to longtime readers, I guess I absolutely hope that they will love this book. Um, but at the same time, like it is because it's sort of like this reiteration of something that is very familiar and beloved to some of them. Um, I when I was working on Alchemized, I was initially very torn in trying to figure out what to prioritize and trying to kind of balance out the, oh, I know this is important, and but then at the same time being like, this doesn't really speak to this story anymore. Um, and it was sort of this weird balancing act that I kept trying to do. And eventually I realized like I just have to let Alchemized be its own thing and just let the things that speak to this specific story be what I put on the page and not take into account like the emotional investment of people that loved this previous iteration. Because if I make that the priority, those some of those decisions will be incoherent to people that don't have that context. And I couldn't. I wanted Alchemized to be able to stand on its own, and so that ended up ultimately being like the priority and the choice that I made. So I hope that they love it. I hope that they enjoy it. But at the same time, I don't want them to expect that it to be like all of the exact same things that they have already gotten before.
Right. Well, Zen, thank you so much for being here today. I can't wait to get this book into readers' hands. Go grab your own copy of Alchemized.
Thank you so much. This is such a pleasure.
Hello, readers. It's time for another TBR Top Off. We're going to recommend a couple of great books to pick up when you stop in for your copy of Alchemized. I'm Mark at my Barnes & Noble store in Cincinnati, and I'm joined by my book buddy Donald in Detroit. Hello, Donald. How are you?
I'm good, Mark. Hi, everybody.
So I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. First of all, Alchemized is so good. It is kind of setting a new bar for dark fantasy in a very interesting way. It's taking a lot of elements that feel a little tried and true and just like kicking it up in a great way. But it made me think of a book that I just finished that won the Hugo Award this past year, and rightfully so, because it also elevates what fantasy can do, and that is The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett. Oh, this book was so fun. So this was a book that follows a very eccentric detective named Anna and her kind of not quite hapless, but very like a bit confused all over the place, sort of Watson named Din. The two of them have sort of a Sherlock Watson dynamic going on, but Anna is such a fun character to read. She is just very snarky and very, very smart. The means by which she comes to her conclusions is always baffling, but she is on it all the time. This book takes place in a fantasy world, very nature, plant-based magic, with a lot of empirical secrets and potential for a lot of wrongdoing that Din and Anna unfortunately stumble into while investigating a pretty horrific murder. There's grand magical schemes. There is a really fun dynamic duo. There is a beautiful sense of world build. And most exciting, this is the first in a series. So a sequel will be coming at some point soon, which is always good news. This book is delightful without being dull. It is droll without being twee, and really fanciful without being completely untethered. It's excellent. So check out The Tainted Cup by Robert Jackson Bennett. Donald, what do you have for us?
So that's a great choice, Mark. I love that book. So, Alchemized has been kind of on the threshold of everyone's mind now for about 2 to 3 months, maybe a little longer. And in reading it and then doing some research, it's the age of fan fiction really getting mainstream publishers involved, getting traditionally printed, really rallying fans of all kinds of different properties and genres together. And so I did a little digging and then found 2 other books that were being spoken about in kind of like the same vein as Alchemized. And one of them is Bridget Knightley's The Irresistible Urge to Fall for Your Enemy. And the other one is Julie Soto's Rose and Chains. Mm-hmm. These are both enemies to lovers stories, which fits again with Alchemized. They're magic-based, they're adventurous, they're action-packed, there's romance. I wouldn't say they're, too steamy, But definitely, if that's your wheelhouse, these are the two. And probably you've already read these. If you're coming into the store to buy Alchemized, you probably already read these two. But if not, and you've missed one, these are both really, really good tie-ins. They're just a lot of fun. They're very fast reads. So after you finish the behemoth of Alchemized, which is like 1,000+ pages, and you still want to live a little bit in that enemies to lovers world, but you're not really ready to invest another however long it'll take you to read a 1,000-page book. Both of these clock in about 300, 400 pages. So, again, those two books were Rose and Chains by Julie Soto and The Irresistible Urge to Fall for Your Enemy by Bridget Knightley. They're both excellent. I read them both. They're both fun. There's not one I like better than the other. That's why I talked about both of them. But they look good on your shelf with Alchemized, as those are the three books everyone's talking about. That's what I have.
That's perfect. I feel like they're sort of like the perfect, like either appetizer or dessert to Alchemized, because Alchemized it does pull from a lot of those elements, but it feels like a meal. And so then you can sort of snack on the other two. So nice job. All right, that is all we have for today. Thanks so much for tuning in to Poured Over. Please make sure to give us a rating and subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. You can also follow us on our socials at Barnes & Noble. I'm Mark. You can follow my home store at BN Westchester. Donald, where can we find you?
You can follow my store at BN Livonia.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Happy reading. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.